It does make sense.
Well, good morning. I'm very pleased to announce this morning that President Trump has signed a new executive order establishing a task force on market integrity and consumer fraud. The task force will focus on combating fraud against consumers, particularly the elderly, service members, and veterans, as well as corporate fraud that victimizes the general public and the government. I'm joined this morning by the leaders of some of the agencies that work with the Department of Justice every day to protect American consumers. Acting Director Mick Mulvaney of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Chairman Jay Clayton of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Chairman Joe Simons of the Federal Trade Commission. Acting Associate Attorney General Jesse Panuccio is also with us this morning. He is one of the key members of the task force, and he'll be available to take questions. Fraud committed by companies and their employees has a devastating impact on American citizens in the financial markets, the healthcare sector, and elsewhere. 2 weeks ago, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Health and Human Services announced the prosecution of 601 defendants in our nation's largest coordinated healthcare fraud prosecution. The fraud schemes allegedly involved more than $2 billion in false billings. 162 of the defendants, including 76 doctors, were charged for illegally distributing opioids and other dangerous narcotic drugs. Healthcare fraud cheats taxpayers and victimizes vulnerable citizens. We will do everything that we can to root it out and to ensure that wrongdoers are punished appropriately. In another example from last month, the Department of Justice announced Operation Wire, a coordinated effort that also included the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Treasury, and the Postal Inspection Service. It resulted in 74 arrests here in the United States and abroad. That operation targeted cyber-enabled financial fraud that caused companies, real estate purchasers, the elderly, and others to transmit money and sensitive personal information on the basis of fraudulent representations by the perpetrators. The department also uses civil enforcement authority to recover fraud proceeds and to impose penalties. Last year, we obtained more than $3.7 billion in settlements and judgments in civil cases involving fraud against the government. Total recoveries since 1986 amount to more than $56 billion. And we've paid almost $8.6 billion, we paid almost $6.6 billion to whistleblowers who came forward to report fraud and to assist our investigations. This new task force on market integrity and consumer fraud will allow us to do even more in a coordinated way. The President's order directs the task force to invite participation from our law enforcement agency partners at many departments and agencies. By working together, we can achieve more effective and more efficient deterrence. Drawing on our pooled resources, including subject matter expertise, data repositories, and analysts and investigators, we can identify and stop fraud working together on a wider scale than any one of us could do alone. In May, the Department of Justice announced a new policy to encourage cooperation internally and with other enforcement agencies when imposing multiple penalties for the same underlying misconduct. The goal is to discourage piling on and instead to coordinate with local, state, federal, and international partners to achieve a joint result that imposes appropriate punishment without prolonging investigations and unnecessarily spending investigative resources. The more that we can focus our resources, coordinate our efforts, the more that we can accomplish working together. Now, for responsible companies that choose to cooperate with our investigations, that voluntarily report misconduct, and that agree to remediate the harm, we will work together with other agencies to ensure an appropriate and just result. This task force will bring together U.S. attorneys' offices and other department components with essential help from our enforcement agency partners to fight fraud that affects American citizens. We will pursue our mission with determination, fairness, and the coordinated resources of all of our federal law enforcement agencies. We expect to focus on cases that involve fraud against the government, the financial markets, and consumers, procurement and grant fraud, securities and commodities fraud, digital currency fraud, money laundering, healthcare fraud, tax fraud, and other financial crimes. One of our first priorities will be to survey all of our members and identify areas of vulnerability to ensure that we devote appropriate resources to address them. Our goal is not to prosecute fraud, our goal is to deter fraud, and that's going to be our primary objective. Next, I want to introduce Mick Mulvaney, the Acting Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. Thank you, Rob. Be very brief, and just very briefly, we are excited at the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection to be participating in this task force. Will give us a chance to prove that a lot of what you might have heard about us since I took over management of the Bureau is not accurate. We absolutely intend to continue to protect consumers. It's what the statute, our organic statute, Dodd-Frank, requires us to do, mandates that we do it, and we will continue to do it. In fact, we have been doing it. The work that we will participate on as part of this task force will build on some things that we have done in just the last several months. Last month, I had a chance to meet in Kansas with the head of the National Attorney General's Association, who have undertaken a major national effort to protect older folks from abuse. Elder abuse, and the type of cyber crimes that we're going to be focusing on this task force. So we're working with our state and local partners on that. Just this week, I think we've announced, or getting ready to announce, that we're working with the United States Department of Agriculture to help do some of the same things in the rural areas of this country. Protecting consumers will continue to be our priority, and that work will build on the work we continue to do with folks like the military service men and women. Fraud is against the law. It already is. We don't need agencies like the Bureau to go out and make new law. What we need them to do is go out and enforce the law that exists, and that's exactly what we intend to do as part of this task force. We will continue to protect consumers and look forward to working with everybody up here on stage to do exactly that. So thanks very much for including us. With that, I'll ask Mr. Clayton from the FCC to step up.
Mr. Deputy Attorney General, will you stay to take some questions? People have a lot of questions about your administration, specifically zero time.
Thank you, Mick. I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to say a few words about the importance of this task force. I commend the President and the Attorney General for their leadership in this area. Serving and protecting Main Street investors is my main priority at the SEC. We recognize that close partnerships with our fellow regulators and law enforcement agencies are vital to helping us detect and respond to fraud. Through a few examples, I'd like to highlight some of the work the SEC is doing to combat retail securities fraud and illustrate how important interagency cooperation is. Last year, our Division of Enforcement formed an internal retail strategy task force to bolster our capabilities and focus on protecting Main Street investors. This effort draws on expertise from across the SEC to develop strategies and techniques for addressing the types of misconduct that most affect retail investors. These include microcap pump and dump schemes, Ponzi schemes, the sale of unsuitable and complex products, which frequently target the most vulnerable members of our investing public. In one example last year, our enforcement division charged 13 individuals with running a boiler room scam targeting elderly investors, alleging that the individuals defrauded these investors of $10 million through the use of high-pressure sales tactics and lies about penny stocks. In this action, we worked with federal criminal authorities, FINRA, and state and foreign securities regulators to bring an end to this alleged fraud. Punishing wrongdoing is important, but it's no more important than getting victims their money back. Our enforcement division has been swift in its response when it sees threats to retail investors. When our investigative teams detect possible ongoing violation, they try to locate profits from fraudulent activity. The Commission often files emergency actions. I've been at the agency for over a year now, and in that time, the Commission has obtained over 20 temporary restraining orders and approximately 30 asset freezes. For example, in January of this year, we shut down an alleged fraudulent initial coin offering that claimed to have raised over $600 million. Not only did we stop the alleged scheme, but we successfully prevented the dissipation of investor funds by obtaining a freeze of the digital assets and a court-appointed receiver to secure various cryptocurrencies held by the defendants. Again, as with many of our matters, we are indebted to the assistance we received in the matter from federal criminal authorities and our regulatory partners. Finally, I believe that cyber threats present some of the greatest risk confronting today's financial markets. Increasingly, we are seeing bad actors using new technology to perpetrate old frauds, including securities offering frauds. In response to these risks, last year, our enforcement division created a cyber unit to focus on cyber-related misconduct. We have not acted alone in this area. The Commission has filed multiple actions this year concerning alleged fraudulent initial coin offerings and has frozen tens of millions of dollars of assets raised in allegedly unregistered initial coin offerings, while working again in parallel with federal criminal authorities. In addition, we have worked closely with other regulators to provide clarity on the application of our laws and regulations to these new and emerging products. I know cyber-enabled crime is an area of focus that the SEC shares with others on this task force, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in this area. As these examples illustrate, our efforts to protect retail investors are often most effective and successful when we work collaboratively and in parallel with our law enforcement partners. The SEC is proud to support this task force, and I again commend the President and the Attorney General for their leadership in this important effort. And now, I will turn it over to Director Joe Simons for a few remarks.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning. I'm Joe Simons, Chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, and I am delighted to be here for the announcement of the Task Force on Market Integrity and Consumer Fraud. Stopping fraud against consumers is at the very heart of the FTC's mission. I welcome this opportunity to highlight some of the FTC's activities in this area, and I look forward to the continued collaboration with our law enforcement partners up here and throughout the government. The primary weapon in our consumer protection arsenal at the FTC is Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in most sectors of the economy. In addition to our enforcement work, the FTC engages in extensive policy and consumer and business education initiatives. Some of our most important work involves frauds that target service members and veterans. In 2017, we received nearly 114,000 complaints from service members, veterans, and their families. To combat these problems, the Commission has developed a multifaceted strategy. We bring enforcement actions to protect military consumers, and we engage in education initiatives to help military consumers detect and avoid scams. Elder fraud is another area of particular interest to the FTC. In the past 4 years, the FTC has filed 40 actions that specifically impacted the elderly. Just a few weeks ago, we charged several companies and individuals with bilking more than $125 million from thousands of consumers with a fraudulent business education program. This program targeted specifically military and elderly consumers. It involved a so-called surefire way to create a six-figure retirement income in less than 12 months, and of course that was bogus. Finally, I want to highlight that the FTC routinely partners with the DOJ, the SEC, and other federal and state agencies to combat fraud in the marketplace. The FTC's Criminal Liaison Unit refers cases for criminal prosecution of consumer fraud to the DOJ and criminal law enforcement agencies across the country. Some of the FTC's biggest fraud cases have involved this type of collaboration. One of these actions involved Western Union money transfer system, which allegedly facilitated a very large number of wire transfer scams, including lottery or prize scams and emergency or grandparent scams. Western Union agreed to forfeit $586 million and enter into agreements with the FTC and the Department of Justice. In another case, the FTC entered into a settlement that required Volkswagen to create a $10 billion compensation fund to resolve allegations that the company unfairly sold cars with illegal defeat devices that cheated emissions tests, then deceptively advertised that these cars with claims that they were clean. That settlement was the result of close collaboration between the FTC, the Department of Justice, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the state of California. and the FTC looks forward to further collaboration with the Department of Justice and other agencies through its participation in this task force so that we can leverage our skills and resources to protect as many consumers as possible. Thank you.
I'm struck by, gentlemen, Mr. Rosenstein's last statement. Our goal is not to prosecute fraud, it is to deter fraud. I mean, is there a better way to deter fraud than to prosecute it? I mean, why is the emphasis, why is there an explicit de-emphasis on not prosecuting fraud?
Well, we're going to continue to prosecute fraud. The goal of any prosecution ultimately is to bring people to justice, but also to have a greater deterrence effect. So I think what the Deputy Attorney General was saying is that when we announce these efforts and we let the public know that we will be engaged in rigorous prosecution efforts and investigation efforts, we would prefer to never have to do that, that the fraud wouldn't be there, it would be deterred knowing that there are these task forces out there. So I don't think there's a de-emphasis on prosecution. I think he was simply...
I cover the FTC, and I've seen the FTC go after people time and time again, and it's always a civil settlement. They don't have criminal authority. They can't prosecute anybody. They can't bring criminal charges. But yet, that's kind of where it ends. It ends with a civil settlement.
Well, in some cases, we use every legal tool available to us. The agencies represented here today in the Department of Justice. In some cases, depending on what the proof is and what the facts are, civil settlements or civil cases are appropriate. In others, criminal prosecutions are appropriate. And the Department is engaged in those every single day across the U.S. Attorney's offices and here at Maine Justice. And indeed, whether it's in healthcare fraud or cyber fraud or elder fraud, we have announced over the last year sweeps that are larger than any in history, involving both civil cases and criminal prosecutions.
Thank you.
So the last administration, towards the end, made an emphasis on prosecuting individuals after some criticism that they weren't doing enough on that. I didn't see too much emphasis on that here, but could you comment a little bit about your approach to prosecuting individuals?
It remains a department priority to bring to justice anyone responsible for fraud, including individual prosecutions.
And if I could just ask a follow-up, what's the concern with the piling on?
Well, it's just about good government and proper law enforcement. So, there is an appropriate response to criminal acts or fraudulent acts, and we need to make sure that the punishments for that are measured. And so I think making sure that we're coordinated as a government in how we respond to these issues is probably best for the administration of justice overall.
All right. Since the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General will not stay through press conferences to answer questions, this falls to you. On the administration's zero tolerance policy, there's total confusion on this. The administration is saying this is the policy, but now most families are not being separated at the border. You guys have lost in California on getting an extension on that 20-day requirement. Can you offer any clarity from Maine Justice on how you're going to go about implementing this policy? Will you continue separating families? And how will you reunify the families under the court order?
Well, this morning we're here with several agencies to talk about our anti-fraud efforts, and that's what we're going to focus on. I would refer you to our multiple public statements that we have made across several agencies and the Department of Justice and our court filings in recent days.
Fraud is an incredibly important issue. There's no doubt about that. But there's nothing from Maine Justice to offer clarification on this policy that, as we all know, has basically caused enormous confusion and widespread harm to families. I mean, this is a political disaster, and this came from Maine Justice. Do you not have any answers from Maine Justice? I understand this is not your job, but your bosses won't answer. About what you're going to do about this policy. You say there's a policy that you can't implement. Will you implement it? How will you reunify these families?
As you know, these are subject to ongoing court hearings, and we have articulated our positions and asked for clarifications from those courts, so I would refer to those filings in which we do articulate the department's position.
The policy, will you continue to separate families? That is the confusion.
Refer you to our court filings.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
How does this differ from, I feel like the Obama administration created a task force as well. Why is there a need for a new task force to do work that was already established a decade ago?
Well, that's a good question. We're going to continue on that work, and there was good work done in that task force. That task force was created in the wake of the financial crisis, which is now a decade past, and focused on specific financial crimes and frauds. And we're going to roll that in, that will be part of the focus. But I think this is a broader effort looking at other areas of consumer fraud and market integrity, such as elder fraud and the growing problem of cybercrime. So I think you can see this as an expansion of the anti-fraud efforts. That task force was a moment in time. This is a larger effort. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for taking questions.